On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Central Procurement Entity Implementation Initiative meeting to discuss the comments received on the draft tariff language, which was posted on January 7th. My name is Elisandra Casillas, representing the Stakeholder Engagement Group here at the ISO, and I will be facilitating today's meeting. I'm also joined by David Butlow from Legal. The presentation and other materials related can be found on the initiative webpage. Next slide. Housekeeping reminders. This call is being recorded and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for information and convenience purposes only. The recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. The meeting is structured to stimulate dialogue and engage different perspectives. Please keep comments professional and respectful. Also, please try and be brief and refrain from repeating what has already been said so that we can manage the time efficiently. Next slide. Instructions for raising hands. We will pause for questions periodically throughout the meeting. You can raise your hand by selecting the hand icon above the chat window in WebEx. Or if you've joined via audio only, press #2 on your device. Reminder, please state your name and affiliation first. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please send a chat to the event producer. Please remember to state your name and affiliation before making your comment. You may also send your question via chat to all panelists. Next slide. For today's agenda, after I'm finished with the introduction, I will turn it over to David Butlow, who will talk through the draft tariff language changes, and then I'll go over the next steps at the end of this meeting. Next. Stakeholder process. This graphic depicts the ISO's process. We are in the draft final proposal and the draft tariff development phase of the stakeholder process. I will review a more detailed schedule at the end of this presentation, and from here I'll turn it over to David Butlow.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So we got a few comments on this draft tariff we posted. So I'll walk through those now and then talk about those comments. And then, of course, if others have other issues they want to raise as we go, that's fine. We'll handle those too. But, you know, and again, following up on the sort of process topics first, you know, this is the first draft of the tariff we're putting out. We don't even have the final proposal posted yet, so we will be posting a second version of the tariff, but you know, we're trying to at least get draft tariff in front of you all early in the process, just to get that moving. But there will be, I'd envision, a second call later, maybe in another month, 2 months, I don't know, depending on the schedule. But this isn't going to be the final opportunity to talk about it. So I just wanted to note that up front. So I think I'm sort of organized the feedback we got in several large categories. We got written comments from SCE, PG&E, and Middle River Power. I'll just sort of summarize the main topic areas, and then I'll get into the content of the comments and then our response. So first, there's a broad set of comments regarding the Section 4 changes along with the proposed pro forma CPE agreement. So that's one area of comment. A second area of comment was the process of allocating the system and flexible attributes of CPE shown resources to the LSEs. That's the second main area. Third main topic is the question of eliminating the LSE aggregation of local procurement, or the perception that we were eliminating that opportunity. I guess the fourth main topic would be the impacts to CPM and the cost allocation of potential CPMs with the CPE being implemented. One other comment area was regarding the RAIM changes. And then finally, there was the tariff definition we proposed of what the central procurement entity is. There are some comments on that. So that's the main sort of broad topic areas, and then I'll just go in and sort of talk about the specifics of the comments in those areas. Okay, so first, going to the Section 4 and the pro forma agreement. Again, Section 4 is the part of the tariff that talks about all the different sort of entities the ISO is in a relationship with in terms of, how we do our market. There's the main section that you see on the screen now, responsibilities of the scheduling coordinator. There's other subsections for addressing the relationship between UDCs, PTOs, et cetera. So we had proposed to add a section 4.18 to define how an entity becomes a CPE. And then there's also a proposed pro forma CPE agreement. We didn't have the draft of that posted yet, but we had sort of teed that up as something that would be shown in the next round. So SCE, PG&E, and Middle River Power all raised concerns with the elements of the proposed registration process in section 4.18 and the sort of general need for a pro forma contract. So on that topic, what we'd say is we did think about that a little more, and I think we realized that maybe there isn't a need for a pro forma agreement, and so we're going to sort of back out those changes, and then also a lot of the changes that were proposed in section 4 that you saw, we will remove those for the next iteration. The thought process of initially adding all that was to model it on the material that we have for convergence bidding entities, for CRRs, EIM entities have that sort of direct contractual relationship with the ISO. So that was the thought process of why we got there at first. And then thinking about it more as we got the comments in and sort of just kicked it around, what we noticed or didn't think about at first was we don't have a pro forma contract for load serving entities. And in that case, we rely on the agreement with the scheduling coordinator of the LSE to cover whatever contractual connection we need to ensure that, tariff obligations are fulfilled, bills are paid, et cetera. And so that's been the longstanding approach. My understanding is since the start of the RA program in our tariff that the idea was being in the contractual relationship with the LSE's SC was good enough. So if it's good enough for the LSE, and if the CPE exists basically to step into the shoes of the LSEs for a few limited purposes, then, the rationale sort of in terms of why would we need that extra protection for the CPE kind of falls away. And so we realize we can just treat it comparably to LSEs, rely on the scheduling coordinator relationship, and that a lot of those provisions that folks had some concerns about, we can just drop from the next iteration. So hopefully that's good news to some of you on the call. What I'll say is what will remain in the Section 4 amendments will be a few things, one of which is today it's just sort of not a gap really, but something that isn't stated explicitly in that section, which is to contemplate that scheduling coordinators do submit RA plans and supply plans as part of the RA process. And so you see right on the screen there, section 4.5.1, you see that amendment there. That will remain just as a, sort of clarifying cleanup type change. And then so Middle River Power asked in regard to that, pointing out scheduling coordinator's ability to submit RA and supply plans is not new. It's unclear if this addition is necessary. And again, you're right, that's not new. It's just adding some clarity while we were sort of in here addressing it. And that clarity is especially helpful now that we're sort of expanding what it is that SCs do in the RA space in the first place. Just it's helpful clarity. You're right, it's not a new thing, but just adding it for that reason. And then another point that will remain in section 4 that you can, the place where the sentence will be located will be moved around, but there was a statement, and then I'll let you kind of go down. It's in 4.18. It's the statement that says that when the scheduling coordinator represents both the LSE and the CPE, here it is, right there on the screen, 4.18.1, that last sentence, if a CPE is also a load-serving entity and the CPE and load-serving entity are the same SC, you have to use different SC IDs. That is something that we think is still important to have in the tariff. So that will be moved up to that prior edit in section 4.5. Just it's sort of a process issue, just to be clear that if the LSE and the CPE have the same SC, we need different SC IDs just to be clear that we'll have a way of separating what's happening. Is that SC doing something on behalf of the CPE? Is it doing something on behalf of the LSE? That's just sort of a kind of an implementation detail, really, but it's sort of important enough that we will want to have that in the tariff. And so before I get off this topic and open up for any questions, I did want to also address some of the comments were sort of, I think, not focusing on this idea that, yes, the CPE, in the initial implementation of this, the CPEs are SCE and PG&E, which are, well-established market participants. They interact with the ISO in a lot of ways. So when we're talking about the CPE in this tariff, it's the CPE in its role as a CPE. So yes, PG&E will be a central procurement entity. It will be a load-serving entity. It probably is its own scheduling coordinator, et cetera. But when we're talking about the CPE here, we're talking about the CPE or the SC for the CPE in its role representing the CPE. So there was, I think, some concern in some of the comments, like we're saying something that's inconsistent because, the LSE is still going to do this, the CPE does this. The point here was to say when we're talking about the CPE, it's in its role as the CPE, not to say the entity is forbidden from doing things. And I'm thinking specifically of an example where we had language saying the CPE doesn't submit bids to the market. And really what that's saying is the CPE in its role as a CPE. So if the same entity also happens to be a load-serving entity, it's a scheduling coordinator for supply resource, it's fine. We're not saying you can't do that. It was just limited to its role as a CPE. So with all that, we can open it questions if there's any feedback on those Section 4 pro forma agreement topics.
David, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat at the moment.
Okay, that's fine. Then we can move on to the next major topic area. And this is, we can scroll down to section 40.3.2, subsection D, as in dog.
Sorry, David, let me sit there. Hold on a second. I think it's page 8. What was it again? Sorry,
40.3.2, subsection D.
Bear with me here. Try not to make you all dizzy. Oh, here we go. 40.2. Okay, so 40.3.2. There we go. Section D. All right, everyone. Almost there. Here we go.
Hopefully we can get all of it on the screen at once. Maybe not. Okay. All right. Well, so this is a section where, an important point was the CPE is there to procure local capacity, but the same resource it procures may also, will provide system RA sort of automatically, and then it may also have been procured to provide flex RA capacity. And so, this 40.3.2D is about how to assign the system and flex attributes of the CPE resource back to the LSE, since the CPE is only there to meet a local obligation, not those other two varieties of RA capacity. So there's a couple comments here. So PG&E had a comment about this allocation proposal, and then what the tariff is saying here is we will rely on the local regulatory authority that has oversight of the CPE to tell us how the system and flex attributes should be assigned. So we're saying here we'll put in the BPM a deadline. That's the deadline by which the LRA needs to tell us what to do, and we'll do it. So if the CPE shows 100 megawatts of, a local capacity, just give a round number, and that local capacity, is 100 megawatts of system, and let's say it's 70 of flex, so there's 100 system, 70 of flex, we'll rely on the LRA to tell us, where to assign that 170 megawatts, in terms of the different LSEs that are sort of being represented by the CPE. PG&E was asking if we could have a default allocation method. I think behind that is the concern that if the LRA, misses the deadline, then as PG&E was saying, there's a risk of stranding those megawatts of system on flex RA capacity. So I think in response to that, in theory, we could have a default allocation. I think, it would be helpful to know what the proposed allocation would be, because I think PG&E referenced their desire for that, and I didn't see a specific proposal, so that would be helpful to understand specifically how we can do that. And I think part of the complication there is in the Section 4 material, which I said we've withdrawn, but PG&E and SCE both in their comments really had some concern about the ISO requiring the CPE to tell us which LSEs the CPE is representing. And so that is sort of an important set of information for us to know. I think for any sort of default allocation, we need to know, which LSEs are represented by that CPE. And then, because it's dealing with the formality of the RA process, we need to have some, I think, formal process to know exactly, PG&E and SCE as the CPEs, we are representing these LSEs. And so without that, a clear documentation of who those parties are, which it sounded like there was some hesitancy to be on the hook for doing that, I don't know how we could implement such a default allocation. So as I said, in theory, we could think about it, but I'm not sure how it would work. So, I'll go to the other comments in a second, but if PG&E is on the line has some more to offer in terms of what a proposed default allocation process would be, you can queue up. And if you're not ready, I'll move on to the next comment. You can queue up in a second. But if there's anyone from PG&E that can address that now, let's try to open the line and see if they can talk about that. Okay. Well, I'll move on to the next comment, and if you want to get in the queue, if you are there, then we can do that. So next, I'll move on to a comment from Southern California Edison. I wasn't 100% sure if I understood the comment, but I think the comment was that addressing the circumstance where a self-showing LSE provides its resource to the CPE to show on the CPE RA plan. So this is a self-showing LSE that is not submitting its own RA plan, but it's sort of providing the resource to the CPE to show. The question is, I thought, shouldn't that LSE get 100% of the system and flex attributes of whatever they gave to the CPE to show? So I think that was the comment. And so if we understand that issue correctly, again, I think that would be covered by the LRA to address through its allocation of the system or flex attributes. I think the complication there is, if we understood the concern right, it would be, really hard for the ISO to look behind the CPE RA showing to really parse, which megawatts did the CPE show on its plan because it was given to the CPE by a self-showing LSE versus, what megawatts were directly procured by the CPE in the bilateral RA market. I think we need to kind of look behind the showing to parse out which megawatts fall in which category. I don't think that's really feasible on our end. And so I think that would be hard to do. There was also a question, I think, about that sort of process about when we say the LRA can't give more credits for system and flex than the CPE shows. I'm not sure if there was a question there or not, but just to explain, that provision is necessary to just make sure that the LRA in allocating the system and flex attributes aren't sort of creating more capacity than the CPE has actually procured. So all we're saying is, back to that simple example I gave before, CPE shows 100 megawatts of local, that automatically will be 100 megawatts of system as well. Well, let's say it's only listed as providing 70 megawatts of flex. So we can't let the LRA allocate more than 100 megawatts of system and more than 70 megawatts of flex, because if we did that, then it's just, creating capacity out of nowhere. So that's all that provision was trying to say. So hopefully that makes sense. And if there was just some, confusion or misunderstanding what we're getting at, hopefully that resolves it. So if there's no questions or comments queued up, I'll move on to Middle River Power had a comment that, in talking about, we talk about system and flex attributes in the tariff language there. And I think they were pointing out that, flexible RA capacity is a defined term. We're not really using, we're using lowercase system and flex attributes. That's sort of not the rigid tariff terminology in terms of the defined terms. Shouldn't we use the term flexible RA capacity? And then they're also saying, since the tariff doesn't have a defined term for system RA capacity, should we create one as part of this process to be sort of more formal about how we're describing this whole crediting process? So I think that is a fair point that, that's true. We talk more generally, and this sort of goes beyond the CPE context, but we have a defined term for flexible RA capacity. We have a defined term for listed local RA capacity, which is local that has a local substitution obligation, but we don't have a sort of general defined term for system RA and for just generally local RA. So we have the three flavors of RA we talk about, but we don't necessarily have tariff defined terms to really get at all of them. That's something we'll have to think about, but I'm not sure if we need to do that for here. If we can work around it maybe by talking about, RA capacity that, in the system contract, say RA capacity that is used to meet the reserve margin requirement. That would be a way of describing system. And, flex, we have a defined term. So we'll have to think about that. I'm not sure that we want to take on the task of having new defined terms to more formally talk about the three varieties of RA. We'll have to think about that. It might be helpful, to do now just to sort of help for further, RA tariff stuff in the future. So with that, those were the three sets of comments on 40.3.2D. And I see that I think someone from SCE is queued up. So operator, we can let Wei speak. That'd be helpful. Thanks.
Hey, David, good morning. Yeah, I actually queued up for earlier section when you're talking about the relationship of CPE. I think it's section for 4.18.1. I think when you said, the CPE is entitled to submit supply plan, but not the energy bids or the CR bids, I think there's a sentence there. If we go there.
Well, yeah, let me just say again, I think basically there won't be a section 4.18. That was what I was saying up front. I think if we're going to rely on the relationship of the scheduling coordinator for the CPE and just leave it there in terms of sort of covering the nature of the relationship, that 4.18 won't be necessary. So what I was saying is, I think in the next iteration of the tariff, there won't be a section 4.18.
Okay, that's good. Glad to hear that. So just to clarify, you won't have any language in the tariff that says CPE is not allowed to bid energy, CR, etc. if needed?
Yeah. And again, the thought process of that was we're just saying the CPE in its role as a CPE can't do that. And the point was trying to draft the tariff here so that in the future, if a CPE is a third-party entity, we're saying, all you're doing is providing, an RA plan for local capacity. That was a thought process. We weren't trying to say that, from now on, Southern California's Edison is barred from, doing CRRs or something. That wasn't obviously the intent. But anyway, that provision would go away anyway. So.
Okay, so just for just want to clarify. I think you're probably aware of this. Just want to clarify. I think a CPE, based on the CPUC decision, is encouraged to procure dispatcher rights. So it will be cases where that CPE not only acting as the submit RA capacity to the CAISO, may also need to act as the resource scheduling coordinator if the resource is procured and the dispatcher rights. I think that's a point. Just want to communicate. Just want to make sure we are on the same page.
Yeah. And again, the thought was, that's fine, but when then it's if you're serving as a scheduling coordinator for the resource, that's when you're submitting the bids. And then so if the same entity is the SC for the CPE and the SC for the resource that has been procured, that's fine. But in any case,
okay,
I think it's sort of beside the point now.
All right, thanks.
And I see in the chat, I think someone from PG&E put in a comment, so I'll need to just read that real quick here and see if I can address it. Okay, so the representative from PG&E, Matt Conley, was saying in their red line edits, they did submit alternative language based on the RMR default methodology that we, I guess, presumably included, later on. I don't know if I might have just missed it. I looked, I didn't see it, but that's fine. We'll look at the RMR default. I think the RMR default was based on, if you could scroll up, the 40.3.2a, where the ISO sort of, before it gives the local allocation to the LRA, it first does calculate a local requirement for each individual LSE, and then it sort of aggregates it up by LRA and gives it to LRA. So it's sort of, as the initial process step, the ISO does sort of calculate, in a sense, a local obligation for each LSE, and then it's not really their obligation because the LRA gets to sort of shuffle things around. So I believe, if I remember right, what we said in the RMR crediting context was we would give the credits sort of based on that initial methodology of 40.3.2a. So I think the potential problem with doing that in the context here was that, I think you're scrolling too far up. We wouldn't know all the load serving entities that serve load in the TAC area. That works maybe for now if all of the LSEs in the PG&E TAC area, all the LSEs in the SCE TAC area are represented by the CPE. But if there's non-CPUC jurisdictional LSEs in that TAC area, then giving them an allocation of the system and flex attributes of the CPE resource seems like that would be wrong because, you know, like a non-PUC jurisdictional LSE getting some of the system and flex capacity from the CPE, I don't think that would be right because they hadn't, you know, sort of signed up to be represented by the CPE in the first place. So that was sort of why I wasn't sure that would work. But, you know, someone from PG&E, Matt Connolly, submitted the comment. If you're on the line and want to sort of address that, or if there was some other thought there, please go ahead. And while you're queuing up, if you're on, and again, the idea with the RMR, I think, was that the RMR was, the cost was going, if I remember right, later on, I think we said the cost was never getting funneled through the CPE, that RMR was sort of different, that it would go straight to the LSEs. And so because in that process, the CPE doesn't kind of figure into the RMR issues, that it's fine to just do it by you know, load ratio share in the TAC area because nothing is going through the CPE. Whereas for the more basic allocation in 40.3.2D, we do have the CPE kind of in the middle there, and that's why, you know, it works in the RMR context. I'm not sure it would work, or I don't think it would work in this context of just the simple allocation of the CPE's resources. So let's, I don't know, give it a moment here if someone from PG&E wants to queue up, and if not. Okay, well, I see that there was here's the proposed language they had, they added in the chat. I'll read it out for everyone. Proposed language was, if the local regulatory authority declines to provide the assignment, system and flexible attributes of the resources will be allocated based upon each load-serving entity's proportionate share of the load-serving entity's applicable TAC area load at the time of the annual coincident peak demand. Okay, yeah, fair. That I think that would be fine language, I think, but for the concern I was explaining, you know, where it would be in the position of giving some of the CPE's capacity to entities that aren't represented by the CPE. I still think that would be something we need to think of. I mean, obviously from the ISO's perspective, I don't know that that's not really something we'd be too worried about, but it's sort of probably not the right, you know, approach overall. And I think, you know, it's sort of giving something to the non-PUC entities that they didn't pay for, and then it's sort of shorting others who are contributing towards the CPE's cost. So that would be the concern of that cost shift. I don't think that would really make sense. So we can let folks think about that for a moment, and then I can move on to some of the other areas of comment just to make sure we hit everything. So there was a comment from Middle River Power. There was, I'm not sure which section we put this in. I don't remember now, but just real briefly, there's an existing tariff provision that talks about how load-serving entities can aggregate their local procurement activities, and that sentence was being deleted, and Middle River Power was sort of questioning, why are we deleting that? What's the policy rationale for that? And just to be clear, the idea would be that would be covered as a CPE function. So we're not taking that away. We're just sort of saying, you know, for the non-PUC entities that want to avail themselves of the CPE functionality we're creating, if their LRA is on board with it, you know, that's how you would do it. So we're not meaning to take that away from anyone. And then for the PUC entities, you know, that aggregation really isn't an option because, you know, I think the PUC orders are clear. It's all done by the CPE anyway. So there's really no place for the LSEs individually to be sort of aggregating and collaborating because that's what the CPE is in existence to do. So we weren't trying to take anything away by that edit. We're just removing it because the idea is now we have the more formal processes of the CPE, and we'll just address it there. But we weren't meaning to take that away. So next, we will go on to the CPM revisions. So PG&E, notes that they oppose the draft tariff language because of the fact that the CPM costs will be allocated to the CPE, even in cases where a CPM is triggered because of the failure of a self-showing LSE to show what they had signed up to provide. So, this is a continuing point of, I think, a discussion between the ISO and PG&E and others. So all I could say really is, your continued concern on that approach is noted, but, the purpose here is to put tariff language that reflects the policy. And so, the policy as it's drafted now would show that the costs will go to whoever has the local allocation, which would be the CPE. And so this draft tariff, I think, reflects the policy direction we've gone in. So if, at the final policy stage, something changes, then, the later iterations of the draft tariff would change. But for now, we think it reflects policy. And so it's really all I can say, other than, yes, I'm certainly aware that there's some disagreement on that point. And then I'll move to Middle River Power's comment. They asked about a reference. There's a reference in 43A.2.2.1, so we can scroll down to that.
The section, David?
43A.2.2.1. 2.2.1,
thank you. 2.2.1.
Yeah, okay. So there's a sentence there that says, or a clause of a sentence that is, provided, however, that the scheduling coordinator for a CPE in no circumstances any share of CPM procurement costs under section 43A.8.3. Okay, so Middle River Power was asking kind of what that's getting at. It seems a little circular. Was that meant to say that a CPE is not allowed to cure or provide additional local RA? So let me just sort of explain what this section is doing, and hopefully, any confusion will be addressed. So this is for the collective local deficiency. So, there's the individual showing deficiencies for local that can happen in the monthly and annual time frame. Those are deficiencies relative to what the assigned RA obligations were. So those are the categories of CPM where the CPE would be exposed to potential CPM cost allocation. What the sort of approach we took here was to say for collective local deficiencies, which are the case where everyone met their individual met their individual requirements, but yet we still have, we haven't met the effectiveness in the different local areas. We still need to CPM, even though everyone individually met their assigned requirements. That's a collective deficiency. So what we thought was that's not something that should have the CPE involved, that if we have to do a collective deficiency, that should just go straight to the LSEs because the CPE did what it was supposed to do. And so if we still need to CPM, that's sort of something that should go straight to the LSEs. We should not get the CPE in the middle of that process. So that was a decision we made. So then this section 43A.2.2.1 is talking about a cure period. So the process is we say, hey, there's a collective deficiency, but before issuing the CPM, we provide entities an opportunity to cure. We say, we need X number of additional megawatts in this local area. We're going to CPM if we don't get that by X date, but hey, everyone, here's your chance. please provide additional capacity. If you do, maybe we won't need a CPM. That's what that section is talking about. What we're just saying is, if a CPE in response to that wants to give us additional capacity, that's great, we'll take it. But because the CPE was never in line to have gotten the CPM procurement costs in the event that the deficiency wasn't fully cured, they don't really get any, direct benefit in terms of the cost allocation because they were never in line to have gotten the cost in the first place. And that's all that clause is just sort of clarifying, saying if the CPE gives us additional capacity in response to the collective deficiency notice, that's great, thank you, we'll take it, but they're not going to get any direct benefit in terms of cost allocation because they were never in line to get the cost in the first place. So that's what that clause is meant to just say. And because the existing cost allocation provision in section 43A.8.3, it's the existing provision, it only talks about LSEs. We didn't add anything to address CP because, like I said, we made a decision. And yeah, let's go down to 43A.3, I think, if we might be helpful. We didn't post it here, but again, like I was saying, we didn't make any changes there. Today it refers to LSEs. Tomorrow, under this approach, it would still just refer to LSEs. So no changes necessary. And then so that clause was just to sort of add some clarity to be clear that, like I said, the CPE would not be in line to get collective CPM cost allocation. Okay, so I covered a couple different topics on the CPM area. If there's any questions or comments on that, we can take those now.
Hey, David, can you hear me?
Oh, Chris, yes, Chris Devon. I think that's you. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. Hey, David, I hope you've been doing well. This is Chris Devon, Customized Energy Solutions. And I think maybe at the risk of derailing this a little bit, I just wanted to go back and maybe make a clarification and comment on that piece with PG&E and the default allocation of the system and flexible attributes piece. Can we touch on that real quick or kind of hold that?
Yeah, sure. So that would be 40.3.2D. So let's scroll back up there.
Yeah, I just had maybe a clarifying question and then an observation on that piece, the suggestion that PG&E made in the chat that you read out about the default allocation approach.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's kind of maybe a baseline question of, does CAISO actually agree that there should be a default allocation approach? Maybe I missed that piece of your explanation. And then, so I just would be interested if you had a response on that particularly. But then also, I think maybe on the concern that you raised in response to the PG&E suggestion to just kind of capture and copy over the RMR approach. I think my view of it was just maybe make a suggestion that the load ratio share thing could work, but maybe with the caveat that it would be limited to those LSEs that are only represented by the CPE entity itself, and then that maybe ties into one of those earlier discussions that you had on, the CAISO needing to have some visibility into what ones of those LSEs they are representing, so it's not just simply going to the non-jurisdictional entities from that LRA. Does that make sense, the way that I'm kind of presenting it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think...
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the first point, what I was saying is in theory, no, I don't think we're against having a default approach if it's a good approach, if it's the right approach, I guess, or it's not a problematic approach. But yeah, I mean, I think all of this CPE, this whole sort of initiative here is to help facilitate the local regulatory authorities, decisions in terms of, creating a CPE. So that's why in the first instance, we're trying to just go back to the LRA and say, okay, tell us how to allocate those system and flex credits. You know, so that's sort of why we say in the first instance, we need to get it from them. And then as a backup, like I said, I think in theory, a default approach could be okay. And we just need to have it be the right approach. And like you said, load ratio share by LSCs represented by the CPE, I think that probably makes sense, with the caveat, like I was saying, is we need to know exactly which LSCs are represented by the CPE. That's sort of the missing kind of piece, is we need to know that with some formality, just because we're, this is money and RA credits sort of going back and forth. We need to have a sort of audit trail, I guess, for lack of a better term, to know exactly that we're doing it right. And then so the reason why I was not sure we'd have that is because in response to some of the Section 4 edits that are, we're withdrawing, but in that context, we had some requirements saying the CPE needs to tell us when we ask, you need to give us a definitive list of all the LSEs who you're procuring for. And I think one or both of the CPE entities said, no, we can't really be on the hook for that because it sort of could potentially change a lot or whatnot. And so that's why I was kind of not sure that we would have a really solid way of having that list, that we need to have a sort of definitive, reliable list of all those LSEs. And if in their comments they're saying that might be hard to do, then what? Then I don't know what other approach could work. So that's what I was just sort of saying. I'm not sure how we do that. I mean, the other thing is, is it really a concern that the LRA would let all that system and flex capacity be stranded? I mean, I guess personally I'd be skeptical. Like, that's a pretty important thing to miss, and I think we sort of try to make sure that for the CTC and any other LRAs that are electing to take the CPE approach, I think we try to make sure that that doesn't happen. And so if, we have a BPM deadline, we can reach out ahead of time, because that would be, that would probably be bad for everyone if in the case of that capacity being sort of stranded, as we're using the term, we could also make sure to do as much as we can on our end to prevent that from happening.
Okay, thanks, David. That helps a lot. I would just react and say that, I'm appreciative of the clarification about, the other Section 4 stuff and some of those concerns about the CPE entities not maybe wanting to transmit those LSC allocations or what the LSCs are representing over. But, and I understand maybe your perspective about it might not be a big deal because they probably won't, the LRAs wouldn't want to let that stuff be stranded. I guess I just, I generally agree with your comment about the idea that it should be avoiding any, cost shifts or things like that. That would be a poor result, if there was some kind of default thing. But I do encourage you guys to, reconsider or, push for having a default approach and for knowing what LSCs are being represented by the CPEs. I think there's got to be some way that we could, come up with an administrative way for them to transmit that over, even if it changes from, week to week or something. I don't know. Maybe it would only be month to month, but I don't really see how that would change that often for that to be that difficult to do. So
I mean,
that's my reaction.
One thought is maybe, if the LRA does not give us the allocation, then, we have the default, but the default is predicated on the LRA separately giving us the most up-to-date list of all the sort of LSEs under a given CPE. I mean, that would still have the LRA, on the hook, to provide us information to process it. So that would be a default, but it's sort of a default that, maybe has the same sort of risk of, if the LRA isn't communicating with us, that default won't trigger either. So something to think about. But again, I think if it's I'm not sure how big of a risk this is, but we'll think about it some more.
Sure, that sounds good. I think that's fine. And just a suggestion I want to throw in there, and considering the default piece of it, I would just be a bit concerned if we went forward and didn't have some kind of default language in there for that allocation. But I won't, extend this conversation any further at this point. I think you've heard my 2 cents on this, so thank you.
Sure. And then I think we have Noah Tang queued up. Oh, and there's someone else as well. So we'll go to Noah first and then caller.
Hi, David. This is Noah Tang from Middle River Power. Can we go to that section about the collective deficiency? So when I originally read the edit, I took it to sort of mean that or at least it may have sounded like the ISO wouldn't allow the CPE to attempt to procure more and show more resources because it didn't have a it did not have a cost allocation. I think what I'm hearing from you is that, oh, no, they can, they just won't get the cost allocation because they were never intended to get or supposed to get the cost allocation for this collective deficiency. I think maybe it would be helpful to just maybe sort of rewrite the section to say that, essentially the CPE can go and procure more capacity to reduce the collective deficiency. They just won't get any of the cost allocation.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think in sort of explaining this now, I think it would make more sense to just not have that sentence in the cost allocation section, not in the curing the deficiency section. Because like when we were going to, I think 43A.8.3, we didn't have it here because we didn't propose any edits in that. I think, we don't need to scroll all the way down to that. But yeah, I think that's a fair point. It would maybe be more clear if we just added that language there and not in whatever it was, 43A.2.2.1.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a fair point. I think that would help make it more clear.
Thanks. And then,
so we just have. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to go back to another thing that you mentioned about the deletion of the aggregation of LSCs. What I heard from you is that because the CPUC established a sort of official formalized CPE process, the ISO can sort of remove this language, which was originally intended to allow any LSC to aggregate and have one FC to perform sort of that duty for them or on their behalf. But it's not clear whether or not that option sort of still resides for non-CPUC jurisdictional LSCs if they don't have a CPE program, but they elect to aggregate together.
Yeah, so I guess the thought there was if we have the option for a CPE that applies outside the PUC, so all LRAs have that as an opportunity if they wish to take it. Part of the thought was it would be too hard to have, the option of non-PUC CPEs and then still have this other sort of aggregation function there as well, which is effectively a CPE without being called a CPE. And and especially now since we're sort of removing sort of some of the administrative hurdles to becoming a CPE, like I said, with not having the pro forma, not having a lot of those Section 4.18 changes or any of them, it seems like it's even more sort of the right approach to just say, do it as a CPE. It's not that, not that big of a hurdle. And if the LRA, it's sort of like if the LRA won't approve it, then that sort of should be, it's not unreasonable to say the LRA should have a say in that aggregation in the first place anyway. So, it is changing it a little bit, but weren't thinking it's really changing in practice much of anything.
Understood. I think since when, we've been going through the policy side of this, this wasn't exactly mentioned. Maybe it would be helpful to put that into the policy of the ISO is trying to now essentially formalizing this aggregation for non-CPUC LRAs, and so therefore this aggregation is going to be removed such that it's, in order to do this aggregation, the LSCs must get, I guess, approval from their respective LRAs or something, right? Because you are proposing to do this more formalized process rather than this sort of these two sentences that were in the existing tariff.
Right, and that's sort of one of the benefits of having this call now while the tariff, the policy process is still open, that we can sort of go back and make sure that point is more clear in the policy paper. So yeah. Okay. So we're at time. I see one other person is queued up, Maria Litos. So why don't we open the call for her, and then we'll hopefully be able to wrap up unless there's sort of any other major issues.
Maria, check to see if your microphone is muted. I've unmuted you in WebEx.
Can you hear me now? Now it looks like you can. Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, so this will be fast just because you mentioned it a couple times about the CPE providing you the names of LSCs in our TAC area. So I think what SC suggested is that the CPUC would actually have accurate information, and maybe the CPUC could provide that to CAISO just in case the CPE does not have the names of all of those LSCs in its TAC area. We'll definitely have the names of LSCs that we contract with, but I think just to get a full list, our suggestion was maybe getting that from the CPUC. So I just wanted to raise that again since you brought it up a couple times.
Yeah. I think I think as the default we could add that if the LRA doesn't give us the actual allocation, the default will kick in based on the information they give us that's the most up-to-date account of who the CPE is procuring on behalf of. I think sort of as the discussion went on, I think that probably makes sense. It still sort of leaves open a gap if the LRA just completely kind of goes incommunicado, but the whole CPE construct is there to facilitate the LRA's sort of wishes. So again, that's probably not a big risk because we're doing this to help facilitate something they chose to do. So why would they then just sort of drop all communication? That seems unlikely. But yeah, I think where the conversation was going, that probably makes sense to add as a default.
Great, thank you.
Okay, and I think that's all in terms of folks queued up. I know I'm seeing that we maybe had some chat questions come in. I think I was trying to address them. Were there others who had chat questions that I didn't get to? I think I tried to get to them, maybe, if they're lingering. Otherwise, I'll just give that a moment. If you had some chat question we didn't get to. Otherwise, we can sort of go to the next steps. So,
David,
final call.
It looks like we do. I'm sorry, David, we do have a comment, more of a question in the chat from Natalie Bouchard.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. I replied to that. I guess I replied to it privately. Yeah, I did offer an answer.
Oh,
there was just a question. The question there was addressing this issue of capping the local obligation system in the monthly process. Yeah, it's in the tariff, just no one, draft tariff, no one submitted comments on it, so I didn't talk about it, but it should be there. There's no, that's still part of this overall process. I just didn't talk about it because no one submitted written comments. Okay, well, we're a couple minutes over, so I'll let us go to the next steps and wrap up.
Thank you, David. The next step in the stakeholder process is the comments deadline for the draft final proposal on January 20th. The ISO will then issue a final proposal and revised draft tariff language, followed by a call sometime in February. And we are planning to take the proposal to the Board of Governors for decision at their meeting in mid-March, with the plan for implementation in October 2022 to be in effect for our year 2023. Next slide, please. As a reminder, stakeholders are asked to submit written comments on the draft final proposal by January 20th through the comment tool. Please use the template on the initiative webpage to submit your comments. Thank you for joining today's discussion. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the initiative webpage for a limited time after this meeting. Thank you.